Hi, my name is Francine. I'm an alcoholic. God. Oh, thank you. Wow. What an experience. Oh, boy. I need to just get my breath for a moment. That was absolutely incredible. Can you guys hear me? I want to make sure you get this. I don't want you to miss a moment of it. Can you hear me now? Okay. My name is Francine. I am a very grateful recovering alcoholic. Oh, that's better. Now I know you can hear me. Wonderful. Wow. I can't believe what I just experienced. I just want to first thank the committee for this absolutely incredible invitation to be of service. Yeah. They truly do deserve another hand. This has been an awesome conference. Awesome. Absolutely incredible. And the good news for me is this time I didn't have to travel clear across the country to come speak. It was like right in my backyard, which is really wonderful. Wow. My name is Francine, and I am an alcoholic. God. So cool. I love speaking after countdowns. I have to tell you, there's a magic that takes place in the room that you cannot describe. You cannot describe. If you have to go back home and tell somebody what you just went through for the last 15, 20 minutes, there's no way in the world you'd be honestly able to capture what just happened. You have to just let them come and feel it, because that's what that's about. I wanted to say that it was incredible for me to see so many newcomers standing up. Incredible. And I love seeing newcomers in a room. But I must tell you, for this alcoholic who is in the middle years, the thing that I am so enamored with is those people who've got not only 1 day over me, but 2 days and 5 days and 5 years and 10 years and 40 years, more sobriety than I have. I just want to say thank you so much for staying sober. Thank you. God. If God willing, a day at a time, July 26th, I will celebrate 20 years of being clean and sober in this program. And I can tell you that people who have come from the places I've come from, women who have done the things I've done, don't get to stand up on any platform and say, 1 day at a time, I haven't had a drink for 19 years. But for Alcoholics Anonymous. But for Alcoholics Anonymous. And women who stood up just like you guys in rooms all over the world. All over the world. I just love you, Ruth, so much. I absolutely love you. I had the privilege of being in Ruth's state a few months ago, and if you think it's high-spirited and high energy when you get to listen to her if you were here on Friday night. I mean, that's just one person. Imagine being in the room with 85 people with long-term sobriety. Just imagine. You cannot even imagine it. I had the privilege of speaking at a conference in New Jersey in September, and they had an old-timers meeting, and they cut it off at 85 because they had so many people. The bottom number was 25, and I'll tell you, there were a few sprinklings of 25 to 30-year-olds. Most of the people were over 30 years sober. And there were like 6 of them with over 50. She was an infant, practically. There were people with more sobriety than her. I mean, it was like I was mesmerized. In this room, I thought, you know, sometimes when I start feeling like, sometimes when I get caught up in my navel, and I forget, you know, what this deal is all about, and I get really sidetracked, all I need to do is be in the presence of someone like that who's just been sober 1 day more than me. Because you see, I've been sober long enough to know that you go through lots of stuff in sobriety. And if you get to survive the stuff, you deserve the accolades. You deserve it. Just not to have had a drink or a drug in 50 years is absolutely incredible. Not to have had a drink or drug for 21 years, you know, or 23 years or 20 years. It's absolutely incredible. So I celebrate you guys that have been sober longer than me. And for the newcomers, I just want to say welcome. Absolutely welcome. You are in for the most incredible experience of your lives. And I know you don't believe it, I know that there's no way in the world that you believe that getting sober is the best deal going. I know it. And yet I can tell you that as you sit here this evening, just drink it in. Just drink it in. Because I'll tell you, this is the real thing. When I crawled into Alcoholics Anonymous in Las Vegas, Nevada in 1979, I never thought I'd get to stick around long enough to tell the story. And there are people in here, as a matter of fact, who saw me when I first came in. So I better make sure I don't tell any stories outside of school, because there are a few of them that can call me on it. Anyway, it is so wonderful to be here. I feel really privileged also being at this conference tonight because it's a conference of women. I don't know about you guys, but when I first got sober, I absolutely hated women. Absolutely hated women. And the truth is, what I came to realize was that I hated myself. You know, I looked in the mirror and I really didn't like that person that looked back at me. And so when I got sober, the last thing in the world I wanted to do was be in a room full of women. Just couldn't stomach it. And yet one day at a time, one of the gifts for me is that among my closest friends are women. Among the people I most dearly call friends, they are women. And that's a gift. A real gift for me. I was born 46 years ago in Atlanta, Georgia. And I have to tell you, it increasingly gets difficult to say that number from the platform. I remember when I was in my late 30s, I would stand up and say, and this is what 38 looks like, and this is what 40 looks like, and yeah, this is what 46 looks like. But boy, I can tell you, it gets harder to say it. But you know what? One day at a time, I get to say it. I just had my 46th birthday a couple of weeks ago, and I get to say that, you know. Get to say it. Thank you. But I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, 46 years ago, and I can tell you, I don't remember a lot of the things about those early days when I was growing up. I just don't. I think the thing that really stands out most for me as a kid is, more than anything else, I always hurt. More than anything else as a child, the thing I really remember was that my body always ached, my spirit hurt. I was always feeling different from everybody else. It was sort of like I was on the outside looking into a party, always desperately wanting to be a part of the party, and didn't know how. I just never ever fit. I was this poor little black kid that grew up in the South, and all I could remember is hating who I was. Hating being black, hating being a girl, hating everything I could possibly imagine about myself. When I was a kid, I remember using razor blades to try to scrape off my skin, and I'd use bleaching cream to try to take off my color because I couldn't stomach living in this skin. It was just so awful for me. There was a TV movie that was out a number of years ago, and I always like to talk about this movie because better than anything else I could tell you, this movie describes how I felt about myself as a kid growing up. The movie was Separate but Equal, and it was about the former Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall's efforts to create some kind of change in this country. It was about the Brown v. Board of Education case, which ultimately integrated schools in the United States. Does it sound like there's an echo when I'm talking? Sounds it to me. Integrated schools in the United States. And I remember in this TV movie, they were trying to understand the impact of segregation on very, very small children. So they had a controlled group of kids, and they brought them all into a room. And one kid after another, they asked questions. They weren't complicated questions. As a matter of fact, they were pretty simple. But one kid after another, in responding to a question, they had them choose one of four little dolls that were sitting in front of them. They had a little black boy doll, a little white boy doll, a little black girl doll, and a little white girl doll. And I remember they came to this little black girl, and they simply asked her to pick out the ugly doll. So it wasn't a complicated question. They just said, of the four dolls in front of you, we want you to pick out the one that's really ugly to you. And I can tell you, without blinking her eye, without hesitating for a moment, she didn't pick the doll that looked like you. She didn't pick the doll that looked like you. She didn't pick the doll that looked like any of you. She picked the doll that looked exactly like herself. Because for her, that was the ugliest person she could possibly imagine in the whole world. And I have to tell you, I was about 10 years sober when I saw that movie for the first time. And yet it dug deep down inside of me and took away something that was so powerful. It dug deep down inside of me, and it reminded me where I had come from as a kid and how much I had absolutely hated who I was when I looked at that movie. Because that's how I felt as a kid. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I was the worst person in the world that I could possibly be. And I remember for the rest of my life, from that point until the time I put down the drink, I was always trying to find something that made me fit in like everybody else. Just didn't want to be different. Just wanted to fit in. Thank you. The earliest escape in life for me came through literature, books, and old movies. I don't know why I just got really, really emotional. It's not the first time. If you've never heard me speak, I can tell you I have lots of tissues at the podium. Usually people that know me bring them up here for me. Oh. Sometimes when I think about the person that I was, sometimes it's so hard for me to believe that that's not the woman I am anymore. You know, I stand before you this evening as a woman who walks with dignity, who knows how to spell that word and who knows how to define it. And sometimes when I think back about where I've come from, it's so hard for me to believe that I ever got to the place where I am right now. You know, I just want to stop for one moment and just say that I know that there are women in this room tonight who can't possibly imagine that they will ever feel any differently than they feel right now. And if you're newly sober, like I was years ago, I can tell you I would sit in this room and I just knew I'd never, ever be able to stay sober for one day, let alone 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. And just one day at a time, I didn't drink. I just needed to say that. I'm not even sure why that interrupted what I was thinking, but I just needed to say that. Because whoever you are in here tonight, no matter where you've come from, no matter what you've done in your life, it gets better. One day at a time, if you stay in here with us, it gets better. Anyway, as a kid, I absolutely hated who I was, and I did all kinds of things to run away from accepting the fact that I was this little poor black kid who grew up in the South and ultimately the South Bronx in New York. As a kid, yay. As a kid, my mother was a librarian, and we had tons and tons of books around the house. It was so incredible. In every single room, there were reams and reams of books. And as a kid, long before I ever picked up alcohol or drugs, my earliest escape in life came through movies and books. And sometimes I'd just take a book off the shelf and I'd sit in the corner by myself and I'd just start to read. And I wasn't really good at reading. I didn't learn actually how to read until I got sober. But you know what? I knew enough to open up those binders. And between those binders, there was magic. Between those binders, even if it was for one moment, I discovered that I was like Cinderella. You know, I was somebody so special. And then when the books closed and when the movies stopped, I was back to who I was. As a kid, I used to absolutely love women like Betty Davis and Joan Crawford and Barbara Stanwyck and Susan Hayward. Those are my idols. They were women that had a glass in one hand, they had a cigarette in another hand, and hello, we all been there. I can tell you, they didn't take too much garbage off of anybody. And that's what I needed. That's exactly the kind of role model I needed. And as a kid, I literally learned how to do a lot of things by watching Betty Davis and Joan Crawford. This is even before I picked up the booze and the drugs. I learned how to smoke cigarettes one day at a time by watching Betty Davis. And I have to tell you, I haven't had a cigarette for almost, I think now it's 15 years I haven't had a cigarette. Yeah. Thank you. The 12 steps. But I learned how to smoke cigarettes by watching Bette Davis in the movie All About Eve, if you remember that movie. In that movie, Bette Davis was walking up that staircase with that long sexy cigarette holder, talking about it's going to be a bumpy ride. I thought to myself, had she only known. Had she only known. I used to stand in the mirror when I was a kid and puff cigarettes. I'd puff circles and I'd choke. And I'd puff and I'd choke. And anybody in here who's ever learned how to smoke cigarettes, you know, just like learning how to drink. You know, I had to acquire the taste to do it. And I learned. I learned how to do it so well. And it was the same thing with drinking. I learned how to drink. I learned how to hold my glass with my pinky stuck out by watching Susan Hayward in Backstreet. And I can tell you there were some other things I learned by watching her in Backstreet as well. The kind of woman that I became was the kind of woman she was in that movie. As a kid, I remember we used to have a full-length mirror in our house, my sister and I, in our little bedroom. And I literally, and I'll tell you, this is really sick, but it's the truth. I need to pull my covers. I used to practice walking like Bette Davis in the mirror, the little switch. Now, it's like really sick, but these were my role models until I got sober in Alcoholics Anonymous. And then I had role models like you guys. But I learned how to do all the things I thought women did from watching women in movies. Those are my role models. I'm a product of the 60s. I grew up watching that stuff. I grew up watching Dr. Kildare and whatever else you watched. And one day at a time, you know, you have become my role models. But for years, that's how I learned how to do the stuff I did, including drinking and using. You know, I was remembering the other day something really, really sad for me, but it's so true. The life that I eventually led due to alcohol and drugs was a very colorful life. I'm a woman who compromised herself in a lot of different ways. And I remember I used to read books about that long before I ever did the things that I eventually did. I used to think it was glamorous to be a courtesan. I used to think that you know, wearing pretty clothes, especially because I was someone that grew up really, really poor, that was something that I wanted to be. I wanted to be in a different place. And the sad reality is, for someone like me, it didn't matter how I got there. You see, because once I picked up the drug and once I picked up the drink, what I did in between didn't count. It absolutely didn't count. Drugs and alcohol took me to places that I would have never, ever, ever gone had I not been drunk or wasted. I would have never gone there. You know, sometimes I think to myself that had there been a crystal ball, and had I been able to look down the road at my life as it was to unfold over the years, for me, there was absolutely no way I would have ever picked up the first drink or drug. For me. Instead, what I would have done was I would have somehow gotten the courage to take my life. Because there's no way in the world, had I consciously been aware of what I was about to do over the next few years, there's no way in the world I would have done it. There's no way in the world I would have chosen to live the kind of life on the streets of New York or anywhere else that I eventually had to do before I came to you. But you see, I'm one of those people that believes that there are no mistakes in God's universe. There are absolutely no mistakes. It wasn't an accident that I had to continue to be out there as long as I did. Because I believe the reason I had to do all that stuff is so I could be here tonight. See, I don't believe my story is for everyone in this room. I'm sober long enough to know that that's not the case. But I do believe that there is at least one person in here tonight who came here to see in the flesh how you get from point A to point C through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. I know that as I stand here. That there is at least one woman in this room, whether she be newly sober or sober for a while. There's somebody in here tonight who came here to see how you get from point A to point C no matter what. No matter what. That's what my story's about. My story's about hope and inspiration. Sometimes I say my story and I'm listening to it, and you know what? I have to pinch myself because I can't even believe that it's me that I'm talking about. It's like sometimes I can't even believe it. I am so grateful to be standing before you this evening. I'm so grateful one day at a time to not be drinking and using, but more than that, I am so grateful not to be compromising my body or my spirit. How many days I've done that? For those of you that are real deal alcoholics, I know you know what that's about. Compromising yourself to the point that you don't even realize what you're doing was a compromise. Been there, done that. I remember when I first came into this program, and I wasn't sober yet. When I first was introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous, it was in 1978 in New York. And I couldn't have stuck around because the truth is I didn't believe I was an alcoholic. Don't ask me how I didn't believe that. I was coming to in Central Park. I was coming to with people who I would not have even given the time of day to. I was drinking in the morning. I was passing out at night. But had you asked me, I would have told you I wasn't an alcoholic. But when I first came into the program in New York, I just knew I didn't belong here. I was 25 years old. I was too young to be an alcoholic. I was only 25. I was living on the Upper East Side of Manhattan wearing diamonds and furs. I couldn't be an alcoholic. Because you see, by that stage of my life, I had long since seen the poverty that I had grown up in as a child. I knew what it was like to sleep with rats and eat plaster off the walls. And I vowed I would never, ever, ever go back there. And so I became willing to do all kinds of things to never go there again. And so by the time I had gotten to the Upper East Side of Manhattan, I knew I had arrived. And you know how I knew I had arrived? Because I could go to Studio 54. It seems funny, but you know what? If you grew up in that era, to have been able to get into Studio 54 meant you had arrived. Sick thinking, but that's what I thought. It was so pathetic for me that this is who I had based everything on. When I was first introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous, I remember reading in the big book those words, pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization. And I can tell you there was not one single person in the room that had to sit me down and say, honey, let's explain to you what these words mean. You know, there was not one person that had to tell me that, because I knew exactly what it felt like to be a real deal alcoholic. I knew exactly what it felt like to be a woman who had compromised herself so much to the point that I did not realize what I was doing was a compromise. There were times when I'd stand under the shower and I would just take it, I'd be scrubbing my body trying to take what I thought was the surface dirt off, and I'd scrub and I'd scrub and I'd scrub it so hard. And I know for those of you that are real deal alcoholics, you know the kind of dirt I'm talking about, the kind that you think comes off with soap and water. You think it comes off by putting a lot of fragrance on. You think it comes off because you wear some pretty clothes, or you think it comes off when you're attached to the right man or woman. And that's where I was. I came in and I knew what it was like to feel totally immoralized. I knew what that felt like. But when I was standing in the shower, scraping that stuff off, it didn't dawn upon me that the dirt I was trying to remove was the dirt from inside. It wasn't until I got sober, really sober in Alcoholics Anonymous, that I came to realize that the dirt I was trying to clean up was attached to my insides. That it wasn't about anything that was on the outside. It wasn't about soap and water. It wasn't about pretty fragrance. It was about cleaning me up from the inside. One day at a time, what you've taught me in this program is how to be cleansed from the inside out. One day at a time, I don't do the things that I used to do. One day at a time, I am a woman who understands, who can spell the word dignity. I know what that means. I know what that means. In 1978, I still wasn't ready to get sober, however. I came in and I just want to say, I don't know if there's anybody in this room tonight who is still drinking, but I have never, ever been to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous where there's not somebody on something. Not something. And so I just want to say that if there's anybody in the room tonight who is on anything at all, I just want you to know that I am so grateful you are here. So grateful. I'd rather that you be sitting in here tonight than be out there somewhere. And I remember that when I first came in 78, I was still drinking in meetings. I would go into the bathroom and I'd pop my Valium and take a swig of my booze and then put it back in my purse, and go back in the meeting thinking nobody knew. Thinking nobody knew. Didn't dawn upon me that you could smell booze through the pores. I didn't know that. So if there's anybody in here tonight who's on something, let me just tell you that we are so grateful you are here. But let me also tell you that if you think we don't know, think again. Think again. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to distinguish between dilated and constricted pupils. And truly, contrary to popular belief, you can smell booze through the pores. But I am so glad you're here. And especially because, you know what? When I first came in New York, they didn't put me out. They knew that I was on something, and not once did people say, you can't stay here because you're a wet drunk. Not once. And I am so grateful for that. I continued to drink. And at the end of 1978, I did what you taught me was a geographic. I had no idea what that word meant. I've learned practically every word I know in sobriety. And so if you're new and you really don't understand what it means that if you physically remove yourself from point A and you go to point C, I know that you probably think you've left your baggage back at point A. Surprise, you carry it with you. And that's what I had to discover. I left New York in 1978 in search of my pot of gold. In search of not myself, but someone else. And I moved out to Las Vegas, Nevada, and it took me 9 months before the fog lifted long enough. And what I choose to say today is that God broke my leg in order to save my life. In 1979, in June of 1979, I got hit by a car in a blackout. And to date, I don't even remember what happened. I absolutely don't. The last thing I remember was I was in the brewery, a place that is no longer in Las Vegas, Nevada. It's some other place now. But I was in this discotheque called a brewery, appropriately named. And the next thing I remember, I had come to in a hospital with my entire body in traction and my leg was in a cast. And I can tell you I had no clue how I got there. And I remember when I came to and I was clear enough, the doctors had told me that I was found in the street on Paradise Road, which was in a direction opposite from my house. And when they found me, they didn't think I was going to live. And when they realized I was going to live, they never thought I'd ever walk again. Because when they found me, my left leg had come up behind my head, and the bone had come straight through. And I can tell you, today I walk with a limp. I don't hide it. I have a really ugly scar on my left leg. It's about 10 inches long with a lot of hole marks in it. And I've often been asked if I'd consider cosmetic surgery because the scar is so ugly. It's so ugly. And I can only tell you that just for today, I choose not to cover it up. Maybe the time will come when I want to get surgery because it's so ugly. But I can tell you, just for today, every time I look at my leg, I'm reminded of the very high price I had to pay to stand before you tonight. I'm reminded of every drink I took, of every drug I took, of every inappropriate act as a woman I ever performed in my life. Every single time I look at my leg. And I don't know if that's going to be enough to prevent me from ever picking up another drink again. But I can only pray that one day at a time, if I continue to look at my leg, I might think twice before I do it. But I have to tell you, that wasn't enough to stop me from drinking. And for those, again, that are real alcoholics, I know that you know what I'm talking about. That no mere car accident is going to stop you when you're on a mission. You know? And it didn't stop me. I continued to drink and use from the time of the accident until I actually got sober. It was 9 months. And I'd like to tell you that even with as much as I had to go through just to get to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, I'd like to tell you that that was enough to bring me in here and make me humble. I'd like to tell you that that was enough to just make me so totally willing to do anything you wanted me to do. And I can tell you that worked for about 5 minutes. About 5 minutes I came in here and I did what was suggested, and then the attitude just came back. Just came back. When I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, I came in and I sat on the side of the room with the people who said, honey, all you have to do is come in here and take up a seat, and you'll get this thing through osmosis. And I love that. I didn't even have a clue what osmosis meant, but I loved it. And when I found out what it meant, I really loved it. And if you're new and don't know what it means, simply put, it means if you sit next to somebody who's sober and rub up against them, you're going to catch it like that. It's a term, it means absorption. You're going to absorb sobriety into your skin. That's what I wanted. I didn't want to have to do any work. I mean, as far back as I can remember, I've wanted this much benefit and I've wanted to do about this much work. And that's been my M.O. Oh, somebody else relates, huh? It's always been my M.O. Until today. But I can tell you, when I came in here, I wanted to do what I wanted to do. And I hung out with the people who were as miserable and as angry as me. I sat in the meetings and I took everybody's inventory. I like to call the section where I sat the inventory section. I used to sit back in meetings with my legs. I had 3 seats, one for my body, one for my broken leg, and I'd have one for my crutches, and I'd sit back with my arms crossed with my attitude, just daring you to make my day. Daring you. And I can tell you there weren't a whole lot of you that were willing nor able to do it. The good news for somebody like me who came in as angry as I came in is that there were a few people who could see past my stuff. The truth is, I really wasn't a bad person. I was just a scared person. Just deep down inside, I had never really had anybody in my life, it seemed, who really cared enough about me to get past the stuff. Growing up in the South Bronx, I had to be tough. I had to put up a really tough exterior. And while it protected me for a while, I found when I got sober it was really a hindrance for me. Because it kept, the wall I created for myself kept me in, and it kept you out. And it's a really lonely place when you sit there all by yourself, full of fear, angry and resentful. But again, thank God for those few people who were willing to see past that. And there were some women that would come to me, and you know what, I'd want to keep them at arm's length, and they'd want to hug me, and I'd want them not to. But eventually, they won out. Eventually, they won out. I was really lucky when I first got sober that I met a sponsor, or she found me, rather, when I first got sober, Louise R. from Las Vegas. I didn't think that I could ever meet my match. And I'm sure a lot of other people didn't think that either. But I met Louise when I was 30 days sober, and lucky for me. I just want to say that if you are newly sober and you haven't found a sponsor yet, in my opinion, it is one of the most important tools that this program has ever given me. To be able to connect with another person, another woman, and in particular for me, it had to be a woman because I had so many issues with women when I got sober. So for this alcoholic, I needed to learn how to work through some of those issues. I didn't plan that it was going to be her, but you know what, God, I just believe there are no mistakes in this universe. None at all. And so God presented me with Louise R. And lucky for me. Louise was a woman who believed that there was no mistake that in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous there was an entire chapter called Into Action. She believed it was not an accident that in that chapter we were going to find most of the 12 steps discussed. And she believed that it wasn't a mistake that in that chapter we were going to find the promises. And she reminded me that if I wanted what you guys had, if I wanted the promises that you talked about, I had to be willing to get into action. And I can tell you, I wasn't. I came in with such an attitude. I wanted to do it my own way. Such an attitude. And as a result, almost at 2 years sobriety, I almost picked up because I wanted to do it my own way. I want to just say that I personally believe for myself that at 2 years sobriety I picked up not because it was just the terrible twos. It was simply because I was unwilling to do what was suggested. I was hanging out in bars at 2 years sober. Not drinking, but I was hanging out at bars wondering why I always wanted to drink. You know? Exactly. At 2 years sober, I was still sleeping with other people's husbands, and I didn't get it. You know, at 2 years sober, I was still sleeping with other people's boyfriends and justifying that it wasn't their husband. You know, at 2 years sober, I was doing all the things that I had done before, but I wasn't drinking. And I must tell you, for me, it just didn't work. It just didn't work. I'm sure had I been able to do all those things for a longer period of time, I would have done it. But it just didn't work for me. I had a sponsor who just kept pounding it into my head that self-esteem comes from doing esteemable acts. Self-esteem comes from doing esteemable acts. Louise said to me, if you act like a whore, you're going to be treated like a whore. She said, if you dress like a hooker, you will be treated like a hooker. She said, if every other word out of your mouth is a four-letter word, she said, then don't be surprised at what you get back. Self-esteem comes from doing esteemable acts. I can tell you this evening as I stand before you, I am a woman who knows what self-esteem is about today. Not just because I've been standing in the mirror mantraing to myself, I love you, for me, but it's been because I've become willing to do things differently than I've ever done before. I've become willing to do those esteemable acts that have enabled me to feel the way I feel about myself today. One of the things, for example, that Louise helped me with, and again, I just need you to know that whatever I share from this podium is my experience. It's what's worked for me, and if it would work for you, I'd please invite you to take part of it. But one of the things for me is I came in with a filthy mouth, and that's as best as I can tell you. A really filthy mouth. Growing up on the streets, you know, that's all I knew. And I don't even know if I didn't know any other words, but all I ever used were four-letter words. And it really got worse when I got sober because I realized that when I came into an AA meeting and I started to curse, I got a lot of, people laughed. There was a lot of support when I started cursing, and it was like, well, that's really cool. And so I thought, if you hate it yourself as much as I hate it myself, it's better to have them laugh at anything rather than nothing. And I remember one day Louise said to me, you know, Francine, you can continue to do that, but if you continue to do that, you will continue to get what you've been getting. And the way I was feeling about myself was not the way I wanted to feel. So one day at a time, she taught me how to change that. I used to have about 10 curse words to a sentence, and she taught me how to reduce it to 5 curse words to a sentence. And then it was reduced to maybe 2 curse words in a sentence. And then it was maybe reduced to 1 curse word per sentence. And then before I knew it, one day at a time I chose not to curse. For me, not cursing was an esteemable act. That's how I learned. Really small, really baby steps. But for me, sobriety has been about changed behavior. It's been about not just being able to quote from the big book, because you know what? I can do that. I'm sober long enough, I can quote from the book. But for me, it's been about taking those black words off the white pages and putting them into my life. It's how do I live today? It's not just talking about it, but how do I behave differently? How do I treat myself? And how do I treat you? One day at a time, for me, I choose not to use curse words. Another thing Louise taught me was how to dress appropriately for the occasion. Simple, I know, for most of us, but I used to come to meetings with short shorts that were about the size of a sash. And I used to come to meetings with blouses that were open up down to my navel, and Lynn probably remembers this. And there was so much of me that was exposed, it was like I should not have had a top on. And I thought that was really cool, and I used to wonder what was wrong with the people when they'd look at me weird when I was in a meeting. You know, all the guys looked at me a certain way, and all the women didn't want to talk to me, and I didn't get it. One day at a time, Louise taught me that bikinis were for the beach and not for AA meetings. One day at a time. Another thing she taught me was that for me, sleeping with somebody else's husband was not an esteemable act. And I can tell you, for any woman that's sitting in this room tonight who happens to be married, if I were in a room with you and your husband, I would be the last person today you'd ever have to worry about. That is through the grace of God and Alcoholics Anonymous. Had you seen me 20 years ago, I would have been the first one you had to be concerned about. The first. One day at a time, I don't sleep with other people's husbands, and one day at a time, I do not sleep with other people's boyfriends, justifying that it's not their husband. One day at a time. But really what happened at the 2-year period is my insides were starting to change, my outsides were also starting to change. The insides were most important for me because I needed a complete overhauling from the person who crawled into this program. But when I was 2 years sober, I realized that as the insides were changing, I wanted the outsides to change. And so I made a decision that I wanted to go back to school, as many of us do, when I was about 2 years sober. And it was a tough call for me because I'd been a high school dropout. And for me, education was never important. I can tell you not one of my benefactors ever asked me where I went to finishing school. They didn't care whether I had a degree. None of that mattered. All that mattered was how I could perform and whether I looked the part when they took me in public. But when I was 2 years sober, something started to happen. I started to realize that I really, really wanted to be different. I didn't know what that meant so much, but all I knew is that I wanted to become a woman of substance. I no longer wanted to be somebody's mistress. I just didn't. I no longer wanted to be the woman who was jealous and envious of other women who could hold a conversation. I no longer wanted to be jealous of other women who seemed to live a life that they enjoyed just because they did. I no longer wanted to be the one who wished I could be in a different place. I remember when I was making a decision to go back to school, I remember there was a person who had said to me in Las Vegas, she said, you know, honey, if you are lucky enough to turn 40, you might as well turn 40 doing what you really, really want to be doing. And I can tell you one day at a time, when I turned 40, I was doing at that time what I really wanted to be doing. I'd like to talk about about the phase of my going back to school in particular because I believe that there are probably some women in this room tonight who are like me, who are dreamers. You know, I'm like one of those I'm like a little kid, and it just keeps getting worse the older I get. You know, I just have, when I was a little kid, I was afraid to dream because for somebody like me growing up on the other side of the tracks, you didn't dream. You didn't dream because you knew that you could never, ever have anything that you really wanted. I'm the biggest champion for anybody in Alcoholics Anonymous who has a little, even a fraction of a dream. Just a little flicker of a passion. Because you see, I know the power of dreaming. I know that with the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, you can have absolutely anything in this life you want if you are willing to show up. I'm living proof that one day at a time, you can walk through your fear, not get over it, not pretend it doesn't exist, but walk through it and get to the other side. I had big dreams, and you know what? They've come true. And now I have even bigger dreams, and I'm working on those. Day at a time, I went back to school when I was 2 years sober, and I started in Las Vegas, and it was really hard for me because people laughed and made fun of me. Most people thought I was totally out of my mind to even think about doing what I wanted to do. Totally out of my mind. They would suggest to me things like, honey, why don't you do something easier? Why don't you maybe be a dental assistant or a paralegal or a nurse? And while those are all wonderful things, it wasn't what I wanted to do. It wasn't what I wanted. And you know what? Today I realize, and I especially say this to the people in this room tonight who have those dreams and feel like there's not enough support for you. I would talk about those dreams and people would say to me, don't do it. Try something easier. And you know what? I realized afterward that they could only give me what they had. Today I'm often heard to say that you can't go to hardware stores and get oranges. And for me what that means is if you go to people who themselves are living in fear, expecting them to encourage you out of your fear, you are in trouble. It's not that they don't want to. It's not that they don't want to. You know, we all do the best we can, and we are in the places that we are. But if you want oranges, you go to a vegetable stand. And I was going to people who could not support me because they themselves were living in their own fear. I went to men in Las Vegas for support, and I went to women in Las Vegas for support. And the ones I went to, except two, couldn't support me. I went to women who hated their lives. I went and talked to women who were mothers and who were working and hated what they were doing. They hated being moms. Many of them got sober and realized they didn't want to be mothers. I went to women who were in relationships. They realized when they got sober they didn't want to be with the men they were with, but they stayed there because they didn't think they could do anything else. I went to men looking for support, found out there were men who hated their jobs, but they felt stuck. So how could they support me out of my fear when they couldn't walk through their own? But thank God for that sponsor, Louise, who believed that self-esteem comes from doing esteemable acts. Louise said, Francine, the sky is the limit if you are willing to work for it. And see, I came up with lots of excuses why I couldn't. Because I'm a believer that the mind is a powerful thing. See, the mind, for me, is what either creates or tears apart everything in my life. Because I am what I believe I am. And as long as I believe I can't do something, then I won't try. And for me, I came up with all kinds of excuses. Well, for starters, I'm black. Poor me. I can't do anything with my life because I am black. And they're going to prevent me from doing it, whoever they are. It's their fault. They're not going to let me get to first base. The other perfect excuse was, well, I'm a woman. I need to be married. I'm a woman. I can't do anything. I'm just a girl. And my other favorite excuse was, you see, my past is so colorful, they'll never let me do what I really want to do. And Louise said, you can hold on to those beliefs if you want. Or you can get up off your behind, use these 12 steps, and turn your life around. One day at a time. One day at a time, I am a walking, talking, breathing example of what the 12 steps can do in your life and what they can show you how to do in your own life. Went back to school in Nevada, started school in 1981. I had been out of school for 10 years. And so if you think it was an easy journey, please think again. It was not. Every step of the way was hard. Every step of the way, starting with the mask between my ears that consistently said to me, I can't do it. I can't do it, you can't do it, you can't. But thank God for me, I've developed smart feet along the way. One foot in front of the other, and I kept walking. I started my first year in Nevada, and then I moved back to New York City in 1982 to put myself through college because I realized what I wanted to do, I couldn't do it in Las Vegas. In 1982, I went back to school. I worked my way through school. I worked full-time. I went to school full-time, and I was very active in Alcoholics Anonymous during that period. And I in particular like to say that because all too often I come across men and women between those very delicate years of 1 and 5 who all get back in life. They all have the right job, they're in the right relationship, they're all back in school, and nobody has time to go to meetings. And I can tell you what ends up happening very often is they don't come to meetings, and then when they do come after a month or two, all the stuff that's been built up, we have to listen to it, those of us that have been here. And I have to tell you that that might work. I'm not saying it doesn't, because I know people that stay sober and go to school like that. But for me, it did not. For me, it did not, and I think part of the reason it did not is because I had a sponsor that would not let it work for me. I had a sponsor who consistently reminded me never to forget how I was even sitting in anybody's classroom. She reminded me that the only reason I was in class was because of Alcoholics Anonymous. The only reason I was able to read a book was because of Alcoholics Anonymous. And she told me that I had a responsibility, absolutely a responsibility, to carry that message back to other people. And the only way I could do that is to be where you guys were, and that was in AA meetings. And so one day at a time, grudgingly, I showed up in meetings. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you it was easy, because I hated going to meetings during that period. The last thing I wanted to do after being in school all day and working all day was to sit in anybody's AA meeting. But the truth is, for me, it was insurance, and I didn't even realize it. Because life was going to get really hard over the next few years, and I had no idea how hard. And had it not been for those meetings, I don't know if I would have made it through. I graduated from college in 1986, and I moved down to Washington, D.C. to complete my education. And in 1989, I moved back to New York City, having graduated from one of the top law schools in this country. Thank you. That is your victory as much as mine. That was a major deal for me. Women like me don't graduate from law school. We marry guys that are graduating from law school. Unbelievable. I'd like to tell you that the time during law school and afterward was easy sailing, but many of you have already heard my story, so you know it wasn't. It was hard for me to get into Georgetown, and it was even harder for me to get out of Georgetown. But I can tell you one day at a time I did it, through the grace of God in this program. When I was afraid to even send out the applications, because I didn't think I was good enough to do it. And I don't often talk about this part of it, but it's so important because I know that there are women in here who want to do things, and they're so afraid of failing. So it's easier not to try because you're afraid to fail. And I can just tell you that failure is a word that we create in our own minds. They're all opportunities for growth, and boy, have I had many. Boy, have I had many. In 1989, I graduated from law school, and I sat for the New York bar. And the real gift for me there was I sat for the bar on my 10th anniversary. It was so incredible. I held my 10-year coin in my left hand as I wrote that exam with my right. And it was one of those very special days for me that will go down in my own personal history book, as is the day I got sober, and as is the day I turned 10, and as are many other days. And I was really prepared. I went into that exam, and, 10 years before of really working hard, I was ready. And the worst thing that could have ever happened to me happened. I failed the test. There was something wrong with this picture. There was something wrong. There was no reason in the world I was supposed to fail that test. I was 10 years sober. I literally turned my life around. I was in service all the time. I wasn't supposed to fail this test. And I can tell you the ego's really powerful, because it almost got me not to take the test again. But you know what? What I've learned in Alcoholics Anonymous is that you just put one foot in front of the other. It's one of the reasons why today I am so enamored with people, and in particular women who have the courage to follow their dreams. Because we've been trained not to do that. See, we've been trained to hide behind people who follow their dreams, but we've been trained to keep ours under the carpet. And I'm a believer that you stand up in your own light. You stand in your own space, and you stand tall, and you do what you want to do with your life. Because we've been given the gift of 12 steps that make it all possible, if we are willing to do it. If we are willing to do it. I would like to tell you that sitting for that test for the second time was really easy, but it wasn't. The only thing that got me through that test the second time was coming to meetings. Every single meeting that I had gone to, and because I had the courage to talk about what I was going through in meetings, you guys got me through it for the second time. And then I failed it again. And I can tell you it doesn't get easier with long-term sobriety to fail tests. It just doesn't. I failed it again. It's like there is really something wrong here. And then you got me to take it one more time, and I passed it. And I can tell you, When I actually was admitted to the New York bar, it was truly one of those very special days. It also goes down in my history book. And one would have thought that after the struggle of getting through the New York bar, I would have probably just sat comfortably in New York and never wanted to leave or go anywhere else again. But because in recovery you have taught me to become willing to stretch far beyond my comfort zone, I became willing to do what I really wanted to do rather than stay in a place I didn't want to stay in because I was afraid to take another exam. I know all too many lawyers who are unwilling to move because they're unwilling to take another test. I didn't even want to be a lawyer anymore, but I didn't. But that's about all I knew. So I moved out to California. And I must tell you, I sat for the California bar more times than I would like to admit. More times. And then, it's really amazing what happens. I believe if you are on this path, and if you are really, really being of service to this planet and to God and to God's kids and to yourself, the messages come to you in whatever ways they have to come. Some of us have really thick heads, and some of us have to be beaten into a state of reasonableness yet again, even with a lot of sobriety. At 16 years of sobriety, I realized that I was so totally consumed by this test that I wanted to take my life. At 16 years sober, the only thing I believe that saved me from not taking my life at that stage, because I had become so consumed with taking and failing and taking and failing this exam, and it had become so much about who I was, even though I didn't want to be a lawyer anymore. It's like, go figure. The only thing that kept me sober, I believe, during that period is practically every weekend I was on a plane somewhere having to talk. And I believe that it was women like you all over the country that literally saved me because I couldn't save myself. You're the ones that every time I opened up my mouth and shared about the most awful things that happened to me and how awful it felt to fail another test, somebody would come up to me and say, "Oh, thank you for sharing that. It was so wonderful. I needed to hear it." It's like, I didn't want to say it. But you taught me to be honest. And I must tell you, in the honesty came the healing. In the honesty came the healing. At 16 years sober, I became willing to let go of that exam. And I must tell you today, I discovered when I let go of the exam, the very thing that I thought I wanted is what I got. I went in-house. I became in-house counsel for a company in California. Realizing I didn't want to be a lawyer anymore, but not knowing what else I could do. And again, I believe that there are absolutely no mistakes in this universe. There are no mistakes. And God guided me to this company that happened to have needed a lawyer who did the kind of work that I did. And when I was there, I realized what my true vision was. See, during this whole period, there was a period of discomfort for me throughout this entire period, and I couldn't put my finger on what was happening, but I knew that ultimately what I wanted to do in my work was to be of service. I didn't know how it was going to look. I didn't know how it was going to feel. But I knew that I wanted to go to my job, whatever that was, and like who I was, and be able to give back in some way. What's happened for me over the last few years is that God's enabled me to create the vision that I so love. I get to speak for a living. I get to do what I most love to do today for a living. I get to take spiritual principles into corporate America. Novel concept. I get to do the kind of stuff that I do in AA outside of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because I also believe that as we stay sober, the world becomes bigger. I get to take that stuff outside. I'm writing a book today. I've been working on this book forever, however. But you know what? The book's coming. Who would have thought? I get to write today. When I was newly sober, I remember being asked of all the things I wanted out of recovery. And on that list, you would have found a litany of every single material thing I lost. You would have found fur coats and diamond rings and kitty cats and stereos. You would have never, ever, ever found the things that I so value the most today. Those intangible things that not one of you can take away from me unless I give it to you. Not one of you. Things like self-esteem, the genuine kind. The kind that comes from walking through fear. See, every time I do something that I'm afraid to do and get to the other side, it's like a little check mark next to my name. And that in turn gives me the courage to do something else that I never thought I could do. Going back to school for me was an esteemable act. Becoming a lawyer was an esteemable act. Stopping practicing law was an esteemable act. One day at a time, everything I've been able to do has got me to the next level. And yet I can tell you, there's no way in the world I'd be able to stand up here and do the things and talk about doing the things that I get to do today had I not gone through all of that period of becoming a lawyer and struggling through it and one bar exam after another and actually practicing. Today I get to stand up before you with the confidence that I can do my job today. That I'm not a fake. For many years I was a fake. I believed I was, whether I was or wasn't. As I was walking my way through school, I never thought I was going to ever be a lawyer. I didn't believe that until the day I was confirmed. That's the day I believed it. Today I know that whatever I put my mind to, it'll unfold because I'm willing to show up for it. So on that list, you'd find self-esteem, the kind that comes from walking through fear. Not avoiding it, not pretending it doesn't exist, but walking through the fear. The other thing you'd find on that list for me today is courage. Courage is a big thing for me. I used to believe truly that courage was about an absence of fear. And today I know it's just about walking through it. The other night I had the privilege of hearing one of my role models speak, Maya Angelou. She was in San Francisco at Nob Hill, the Masonic Temple. And it was an incredible program. I look at this woman who I so admire and I think, yes, I want to be like her when I grow up. And what she talks about over and over and over again is courage. She says that courage is the key ingredient to a successful life, no matter how you define success. No matter how you define it. For me, courage is key. It's one of those things on that list. What you'd also find on my list today is the gift of a faith that works under all conditions. You know, I got sober and agnostic. And if you're new and aren't really sure what that means, it means I wasn't an atheist. I knew that there was some God out there, but not for me. I mean, I knew there was a God because in my family they were Southern Baptist and they used to throw it down my throat. So I knew there was somebody out there, but not for me. I didn't want that kind of God. And so, as a kid, I left it. I put God on the shelf a long, long time ago. When I got sober, I discovered God. I believed truly that it was God that guided me to Alcoholics Anonymous, and then in turn it was Alcoholics Anonymous that guided me to God. Today I would no more do without my faith than I would air, food, or sunshine. Just like the 11th step says. And that's so weird for me, you know. Even hearing myself say that, it's like, sounds so Pollyanna-ish. You know, believing in God, God stuff. I went back to church about 5 years ago, and this is just my own experience. I was living in Los Angeles before I moved to Mill Valley about 2 years ago, and I discovered a place called Agape, which is a really powerful, very spiritual place that's so connected to Alcoholics Anonymous. It was there that my faith then expanded even more. I got it here, and you've allowed me to go out and expand it. And you've also shown me that there are people all over the world who are spiritual beings just like me. All over the world. That we don't even have a cap on it. I know we think sometimes we do, but it begins here, but then it goes out there. What you'd also find on that list for me today is the gift of my mother. And I know that's a really nasty word to say in an AA meeting, especially a women's meeting. You know, I got it. But I just want to say that, I'm really grateful to the women who were here when I first got sober who hated their mothers. The ones who bashed them in AA meetings and blamed them for everything. I'm so grateful for those women because at least I didn't feel alone or like a leper when I came in here. I felt like I was like everyone else. But I must tell you, I am also grateful to the women who had the courage to walk through that. I'm so grateful to the women in this program who started having relationships with their mothers because they eventually showed me how to have one with mine. And that doesn't mean that my mother's perfect, but you know what? It doesn't mean that I'm perfect either. I hated my mother so much because of who she was. I'm just like her. It's part of the news. I used to sit around blaming my mom for everything. She burped me wrong. It was her fault. You know, everything was her fault. I demanded so much from this woman. I wanted her to be perfect, and yet I wanted her to accept my imperfections. Tall order. Nobody could have been perfect under my eyes, but yet I wanted her to remember that I was only human. There seems to be an unfairness there, and eventually I came to realize that. Today I have a relationship with my mother that is so special and so sweet. And again, it doesn't mean that it's perfect. It just means that we are both willing to walk through whatever it is we have to walk through to be in relationship with each other. When I graduated from law school, we were entitled to 3 invitations, and I had about 50 people come up from New York or come down from New York. I went around collecting all the invitations that nobody wanted, so I had 50 people, and a couple of them are here today who were at my graduation. And when they called my name to come and get my diploma, my mother's voice was the loudest one in the room. It was like so incredible. This is the same woman who tried to have me put away not too many years earlier because of my drug addiction and alcoholism. My mother is one of those gifts on my list today. What you'd also find on that list is the gift of love. The gift of love. You know, I'm one of those people who came in here hating everybody. I didn't like men. I didn't like women. Doesn't leave too many people in between. You know, I just didn't like anybody. I came in here hating everyone, but in particular, I came in here hating everybody for the 2% of the things that I personally believe separate me from you. And this is, again, my own opinion. I believe if this room right now were dark, the only thing I'd be able to connect with would be your spirits. That's all. I wouldn't be able to see your skin color. I wouldn't be able to see what color your eyes were. I wouldn't know who you slept with or who you didn't or what your religion was. All I would be able to connect with would be your heart. 2% of the things that separate me from you are the things that I used as barriers. I hated people for the color of their skin, for their religious choices, for their sexual preferences. I hated anybody who was different from me, which is everybody. Everybody. One day at a time, my heart has become open. And I must tell you, that is probably one of the greatest gifts that you've given me in sobriety, an open heart. Today I have friends in my life that look like the United Nations. You know, my coterie of friends are from all over. Today, my husband, and that's a big thing to be able to say my husband, which is also a gift. My husband's Jewish. He's Jewish and he's from the Bronx. And I can tell you, that's not even the diversity issue in our family. The real diversity issue in our family is that he's a therapist. That's right. Anybody that knows me knows that's a big thing. Diversity. And the irony, too, is today I get to talk about that in business. I get to talk about the thing that I so needed to heal in myself. God allows me to give that back to the world. The gift of an open heart. I got married in May, and I just want to say that that for all of you women out there who believe that it will never ever happen to you, I got married at 45 years old, and it was the very first time I've ever been married. That's right. And one of my sponsees says to me, I am the patron saint of women over 40 who were not willing to settle. Because that's the key. So Richard's on my list of things I'm grateful for as well. I just want to say it has been such a pleasure to be up here tonight, and I felt, it's strange. Sometimes I'm very comfortable up on the platform, and sometimes I'm not, and tonight I felt a little uncomfortable. But you know what? The thing about me is that even when I'm uncomfortable, I show up. If nothing else you get from my story, even if, it was hard to connect because my fear comes up, and then my fear kind of engulfs the room sometimes. But if nothing else you get from my story, I pray that you walk away with one piece, and that is that no matter what, you can show up. No matter whether there's fear, no matter what obstructions are in our way, no matter what, one day at a time, we can show up. I'd like to close this by reading something from conference-approved literature, in case there are any AA purists in the room tonight. This happens to be the big book, real conference-approved literature. Although I must tell you that usually in my talks with As Bill Sees It, and I was sick at the thought that I actually left it at home, and the literature table was cleaned up, and I couldn't even find an As Bill Sees It out of 3,000 women. I couldn't believe it. So God said, you go somewhere else. I just let myself be guided, and I found this passage in the chapter Freedom from Bondage. And I just want to read this because this was one of the chapters that I read when I was newly sober that kept me coming back. It's on page 553 in our big book, and it starts like this. The only real freedom a human being can ever know is doing what you ought to do because you want to do it. This great experience that released me from the bondage of hatred and replaced it with love is really just another affirmation of the truth I know. I get everything I need in Alcoholics Anonymous. Everything I need, I get. And when I get what I need, I invariably find that it was just what I wanted all the time. Thank you so much for my sobriety. Thank you for showing me how to become the kind of woman that I didn't even want to be when I was new. And for that, I am so very grateful. Thank you.